The year is 1950. The Cold War has allowed a conflict to break out in the Korean peninsula. CBS, the first TV channel to broadcast in colour, and Silicon Valley are discovering the power of the transistor that will define the rest of the 20th century. And over in Burbank, California, Walt Disney is about to take the biggest risk of his career so far, with the release of Cinderella on February 15th, 1950.
And it's this moment here that will forever change the course of the Walt Disney Company, and yet we're here to ask, what if Cinderella had bombed at the box office?
Did you ever see such a beautiful dress? And look, glass slippers. Why, it's like a dream. A wonderful dream come true.
However, this wasn't the case for Walt Disney, as since 1937's success of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, he had been enduring one nightmare situation after the other. Not one of Walt Disney's projects since Snow White's release had returned the critical or commercial result he had wanted and so desperately needed. Pinocchio, Fantasia, Bambi had all failed to bring a profit, with each making less of a box office than their sizable and out-of-control budgets. The only glimmer of hope in this time was Dumbo, which returned a modest $700,000 profit for the studio. However, this wasn't to last, as with the attack on Pearl Harbor a mere 5 weeks after its release, America's involvement in World War II would inevitably force the studio to succumb to the pressures of the outside world, as the nearby Lockheed aircraft plant would commandeer the Disney studio lot. And in light of this, the company decided to refocus toward the collective war effort, producing motivational propaganda material such as The Führer's Face and vital educational movies with victory through air power. And no matter how much pride Walt had in his company's contribution, it nevertheless left the company ravished of talent, creative direction, and most importantly, the financial security to continue pursuing his dream. But by 1947, Walt Disney Productions was still $3 million in debt. With a bleak future ahead, Walt Disney argued for the funds to create one more feature-length animated film. This would be Cinderella. With a $2.9 million budget and the first animated movie since 1942's Bambi, the bar was set extremely high, with this film being tasked with the seemingly insurmountable goal of saving the Disney Company from potential bankruptcy. And yet, Cinderella blasted past $10 million at the box office, and was Disney's greatest theatrical success since Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937. However, much more than the commercial success, Cinderella had also garnered the critical acclaim that Walt Disney had previously sought, being referred to at the time in the reviews as a masterpiece. But to add to all of this impact, Cinderella also marked the first time that Disney would release a soundtrack in tandem with the movie's release, under their own music company, where the song Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo would become a massive popular hit of the day, covered by the likes of Louis Armstrong and Perry Como.
Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo, Saligadoola, Metchikaboola, Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo. Put 'em together and what have you got? Bibbidi Bobbidi, Bibbidi Bobbidi, Bibbidi Bobbidi, Bibbidi Bobbidi.
But all of this brings us back to the question of what if Cinderella had actually bombed at the box office instead? What if this movie had been met with such a tepid response and rejected for its oversimplification that an alternative timeline would have unfolded? So what major ramifications would this have had on the Walt Disney Company?
That the Disney Company would be so deep in debt that Walt and Roy Disney would have been forced to make the decision to either declare bankruptcy and start fresh, or they could have made drastic moves in retaining their Disney name and simply licensing out the characters' merchandising rights and selling off the distribution rights to many of their short films and feature-length animations as the advent of TV was coming and content was needed. This would have also likely seen Disney shift away from animation and into the world of live-action movies. However, in this alternative timeline, it would have still allowed Walt to follow his dream of creating Disneyland, as we already knew that Walt Disney had become disenchanted with animation, and certainly a massive failure of this kind would have pushed him even faster into the disillusionment with the process. But Walt, without Cinderella's success, would have found it much harder to gain the leverage with ABC, the TV network, to produce the Disneyland story and essentially fund the building of Disneyland. So it's reasonable to say that this would have been a drastically scaled back version of the Disneyland that we saw in 1955, possibly being a lot closer to the idea behind the Mickey Mouse Park that was originally located to be across from the studio lot. Or there is the other direction, for an alternative timeline altogether, and that is Walt might have returned to his original idea when he first came out to Hollywood, and that is that Walt Disney may have started a small production company funded by bigger studios, similar to how Amblin Entertainment works for the critically acclaimed director Steven Spielberg, as the Disney name would have still carried a lot of public recognition at the box office.
Additionally, within this alternative timeline where Cinderella had failed, it would have had greater repercussions on the rest of the animation industry.
As MGM shut down the Tex Avery animation unit in 1953 and the Hanna-Barbera unit in 1957. So you can only imagine such a massive animated flop, with it being 8 years since the last animated feature, would have caused speculation throughout Hollywood that the animation industry was officially dead and audiences had lost their taste for it.
And the last scenario here has an even greater immediate impact on a beloved franchise, and that's Star Wars.
As Disney had pioneered merchandising in the 1920s and 30s with Mickey Mouse, but it was with Cinderella that Disney was revolutionary in the synergistic release of Cinderella dolls and toys and merchandise alongside hit records and of course the movie itself. And it wasn't until George Lucas in 1977 became the first person since Walt Disney to truly see the power of the merchandise for a movie that would enable him to build a brand worth $4 billion, which in 2012 he would then sell to the Walt Disney Company.
So in conclusion, it could be argued that it was Cinderella, not Snow White, that had a much greater impact on creating the Walt Disney Company that we know today, as Cinderella directly impacted the Disney parks with the creation of Disneyland. It ushered in the return of feature-length animation, and it pioneered this new and innovative strategy of a synergy of assets and properties within the company, which makes Disney one of the most beloved brands in the world. But that's just all one guy's opinion. So until the next time, remember, keep pointing with two fingers.